Okay, let me begin with a quick who am I? Don't call out though till the end, or we'll give everyone an opportunity to see if we can figure it out. So, who am I? I am a sin. C.S. Lewis says, no one in the world is free from this sin, but everyone in the world loathes when we see it in someone else. He goes on to say that this sin is the center of Christian morals. Okay? Forget unchastity or anger. Forget greed or drunkenness. These are mere flea bites in comparison, says C.S. Lewis. There is no sin that makes a person more unpopular, but no sin of which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. Hardly anyone in the world, he says, except Christians, ever imagine they are guilty of this sin. And can I say, by way of personal testimony, as a pastor, I'm still yet to hear anyone confess this sin. And that sin is pride. Well done. It is the sin of pride. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says, pride is the essential vice, the utmost evil. It is what turned the devil into the devil. Pride is the meta-sin, the sin behind all other sins, the complete anti-God state of mind, and the chief cause of misery in every nation and family since the world began. Yet if that's not terrifying enough a description of the insidiousness of pride, pride is the one sin that we cannot eradicate by fighting it. Now that might sound weird, but pride is defined as making everything about me. And so as soon as we try to fight pride in me, I'm still making everything about me. I'm still being proud. And this is why our passage today is so important, all right? So we all suffer from pride, and we all loathe others we see as proud. And so that little heading at the beginning of the passage we read today, it says a warning against hypocrisy. This should make us all want to sit up and listen. You see, the word hypocrite, it comes from the Greek word meaning play acting. All right. So when actors would step onto a stage, they'd put a mask on and they would pretend to be someone else, right? But in Jesus' day, the word was used for more than just stage actors. It was used for life. Those who say one thing and do another are hypocrites. And in our passage today, Jesus starts to let loose on the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. Now, Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees has been slowly bubbling up towards boiling point across his ministry. Now, he didn't start the war. In fact, early on in his ministry, he had a meeting with a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. And he actually explained to Nicodemus who he was. He was the Son of Man. But opposition has been slowly escalating from the Pharisees across his ministry, and it got to a point where Jesus actually started to publicly attack the Pharisees. We believe that started to happen about a year before this incident, before this passage tonight, back in Matthew chapter 15. But now, just days before his crucifixion, Jesus lets loose on the Pharisees. We're going to come back and look at the climax of this in next week's passage, but in today's passage, Jesus calls the Pharisees out for their hypocrisy. He attacks them for acting all humble, acting very pious, when in reality, they are chock full of pride. And I've got 3 points today to help us heed Jesus' warning here against the hypocrisy of pride, against hating pride in others, when we're actually chock full of pride ourselves. So, we're going to begin by unpacking exactly why Jesus says the Pharisees are hypocrites. That's our first point. We're then going to go behind the symptoms of pride and try to determine what has led to this. Because if we can determine what the Pharisees are actually looking for, that's our second point, it will actually help us diagnose pride in ourselves, all right? So if C.S. Lewis is right and we're all proud, then we all need this diagnostic tool. We'll then conclude with our application, which is how to beat the sin of pride out of ourselves, and I've titled that, How to Fix the Pharisees' Problem. So, if you would like to know how it is we can combat the most insidious of sins in ourselves rather than just hate pride in others, then please come with me as we look at the why this morning, the what, and the how of defeating pride. All right, so we pick up our narrative. Jesus has been punching the Jewish leaders all around the ring the last couple of chapters, but in this passage, the gloves come off. Have a look, chapter 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and the disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach." So Jesus is calling the Pharisees out as hypocrites. They do not practice what they preach. But why then does he start out by saying we must do everything they tell us? Doesn't that sound a little odd to you? Well, the reason is you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, so if a preacher or a pastor falls from grace, don't throw out their biblical teaching as well. Now, we might want to check that what they've been teaching us is actually biblical, but Jesus' point here is we are to obey biblical teaching regardless of who teaches it. So in recent years, there's been a whole spate of very famous preachers or megachurch pastors who have been stood down from ministry. Some of them are from sex scandals, some of them are from financial scandals, some of them from bullying, some of them from sexual abuse of people. And look, it hurts when someone we look up to is shown to be a hypocrite. But what Jesus is saying here is that when sin nullifies a person's ministry, it does not nullify God's word. Right? So we are to be careful to do the good things that bad teachers might teach us. Yet the Pharisees are bad teachers, and Jesus calls them out with a series of charges. So it begins in verse 4. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Now, like I said last week, Jesus demands a lot from his followers. He really does. But those demands are there to give us life to the full. That's in John 10:10. I have come to give life to the full. And the job of a shepherd, of a spiritual leader, is to outline God's demands to people, but also show that those demands are not cumbersome or burdensome. So my prayer is that you leave here each Sunday having heard Jesus' demands, all right? They are demands, but knowing that Jesus' demands are for our good. And on top of that, even if we mess up with Jesus' demands, he's taking care of that for us in the cross. Okay? The Pharisees were not interested in helping the flock bear the weight of God's demands. And the next verse tells us why. And this is sort of the central point of this passage, verse 5. Everything they do is done for people to see. See, the Pharisees didn't get into ministry to help people. They got into ministry to feed their ego. I was actually watching an episode of The Chosen during the week. Can I say again, required viewing for all Christians. It's not as a teaching tool. It is just a beautiful, beautiful piece of entertainment. It is amazing. But anyway, in this passage, there was two disciples were trying to find their way, and so they stopped to ask a Pharisee who was standing on the side of the road praying. All right, so the Pharisee's there, his eyes closed, his hands are raised, and every time the disciples said, "Excuse me," the Pharisee just waved them off and kept praying. All right, "Sorry, I can't help you. I'm busy being seen." And this is what Jesus condemns the Pharisees for. Everything they do is designed to make themselves look good. And he gives us a whole bunch of examples. So first in verse 5, he talks about phylacteries. What are phylacteries? There's a word that doesn't come up that often. Phylacteries were little boxes, usually leather boxes, that contained bits of paper with Bible verses on them. And what they would do was they would wear these little boxes strapped to their foreheads or strapped to their arms. Now, why would they do that? It's because in Deuteronomy 6:8, God says to tie his commands as symbols on your foreheads and on your arms. And so they took that symbolic command and made it literal, to look good, to look holy and pious. Second, they love the places of honor at banquets. Verse 6, all right? Sitting with all the dignitaries makes you look good. Getting the places of honor in the synagogue makes you look good. By the way, just so you know, the places of honor in the synagogue were down the front. For some reason, it's the opposite in Anglican churches. The back rows fill up first here. But I'm sure that's because you're all being very humble, right? Yeah, let's go with that, Brennan, yeah. Third, they loved the fact that everyone wanted to shake their hand. Verse 7, all right? They were the Hollywood celebrities of their day, and they were all out for getting more likes. And then finally, they loved honorific titles like being called rabbi. Verse 7. So in a nutshell, what Jesus is saying here was the Pharisees were not about feeding the flock. They're about feeding their ego. Yet before we can fix this problem, we need to properly diagnose it. Okay? So just like when you go to a GP, if it's a good GP, they'll want to run some tests, right? They want to figure out what's really going on behind the symptoms. And when we run some tests, what we learn is that pride stems from our design as humans. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, according to Genesis chapter 1, humans are made in the image of God. Now, we looked at that a little, I think it was earlier this year, it might have been last year. We looked at what the image of God means. All right, it means being made to rule and being made to relate. And this is the second one I want to focus on, to be made to relate. What that means is we have been designed with a hole in our heart. All right, we were designed that way. This is before the fall. We were designed with a hole in our heart that needs to be filled with love and acceptance from other people. So this is why there was something not good in creation. It was not good for the man to be alone. All right? Adam needed Eve. He needed another person to fill that hole in his heart, to fill our need for love and acceptance. But we haven't just been designed with a craving for human relationships. We've been designed with a craving for a relationship with God. As Blaise Pascal famously said, there is a God-shaped hole in every human heart. And the reason God designed us with that hole is he wants to fill it through a relationship with us. All right? He wants to be the person who makes us feel most human, most satisfied, most happy, and most loved and accepted. The problem is the fall has messed all that up. All right, so not only are we now estranged from God, we can't hang out with with him in the garden anymore until heaven. All right, but we also have this inner realization that we're not actually worthy of relationships with people. We're not actually worthy of love and acceptance from other people. The reason being, we know we're sinful, all right? And this unworthiness, it doesn't sit well with us. We're not designed to feel unlovable or rejected. They are very alien feelings and very horrible feelings for a human to feel, all right? And humans will do anything to try and soothe those horrible feelings. And this is where pride comes in, all right? Okay? Pride is the practice of trying to show those around us that we actually are lovable and acceptable. Okay? Pride is trying to cover over our deep insecurities by showing people that we're worth it. And it comes in numerous forms. All right, and each person will pick one of those forms in order to show others that we are lovable and acceptable. So for the Pharisees, they chose being honoured as very religious people, as very moral and pious people. And this is more common today than many people believe, all right? These are the people whose worlds come crashing down around them if they're ever confronted with some sin in their life. Now, why does their world come crashing down? Because being seen as a moral and righteous or religious person is how they show others that they are lovable and acceptable. Another example that's pretty poignant for our present cultural moment is virtue signalling. Now, you may not have heard of virtue signalling before, but virtue signalling is when you make subtle little comments, which in reality are not that subtle, all right, to indicate how moral we are. So there's a famous video on YouTube of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's being asked a question by a teenage girl, and in the question, the teenage girl uses the word mankind. And Justin Trudeau interrupts her to say, he's in this huge audience, and he interrupts her to say, we don't say mankind anymore, we say people kind. Now, to begin with, there's no such word as people kind. I know that because Word put a red squiggly line underneath it when I typed it in to my sermon this week. But here's the thing, for a Prime Minister to have to stop a teenager to insert some political correctness stems from a deep need to show people I'm worth it. Right? Virtue signalling stems from a place of deep insecurity. But it's not just progressives that are deeply insecure. Why do you think Trump shoots out an abusive tweet whenever someone says something nasty about him? Like you would think that that kind of thing is above the office of the president. But no, it is just another symptom of pride. This time, shooting down our opponents. All right, there's plenty of other options. Some people desperately need to get married to show they're worth it. Some people look to a successful career or making a lot of money. Some people are desperate to have well-behaved kids or successful kids. Others really need a big growing church or to be seen as a good preacher. All right? All ways to feed our ego. And no one is immune to this. The reason being, we are designed to need love and acceptance, and we're designed with a hole in our heart, but sin has made us even more desperate to fill that hole, to soothe those insecurities about being sinful. So here's the thing. If we all possess this very ugly character trait called pride, albeit in different forms, the million-dollar question is, how do we fix it? Well, here's our application for today, but there's 3 things we can do by way of application. 3 steps we can take to try and fix the problem of pride in our lives. Now, all of them come from C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity. It's a brilliant, I think it's the second best book ever written after the Bible, but they're also found in our passage today. Okay, so step 1 is we first need to realise one is proud in the first place. As C.S. Lewis says, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me or refuse to take notice of me or shove their oar in or patronise me or show off? All right? The more we hate the sin of pride in others, the more we possess that sin of pride in ourselves. But if that doesn't work, there's a second diagnostic tool. Lewis says pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. So he says, if your religious life, so he's using an example, or the example is your religious life, okay? If your religious life, if you being a good Christian is making you feel pretty good about ourselves, in particular better than others, then he says, I think we can be sure that we're not being acted on by God, but by the devil. Now, it's not wrong to be happy that we've pleased someone. The trouble begins, says Lewis, when you pass from thinking, look, I've pleased this person, all is well, to thinking, well, what a fine person I must be to have done so. So what are those areas that we like to think of ourselves as more highly than others. So, step one to fixing a problem is recognizing there's a problem in the first place. Step two, says Lewis, is to look upon ourselves with sober judgment. Or as Lewis more eloquently puts it, to see yourself as a small, dirty object. That's a direct quote. To see yourself as a small, dirty object. And we actually see this in verses 8 to 10. So let me just read verses 8 and 9 to you. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you're all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Now, Protestants look at this verse, and we have a tendency to look down on Roman Catholics because, well, they call their religious leaders, their Catholic priests, father. And I'm going to be honest with you, I feel uncomfortable when people refer to me as father. But here's the question. Why don't I feel uncomfortable when people refer to me as a teacher, which is in verses 8 and 10? Are we maybe misunderstanding what Jesus is getting at here? I think Jesus' point is, when we compare ourselves to God, now God is the rabbi, the father, the teacher, what happens is we come up against something that is immeasurably superior to us in every single respect. Right? What Jesus is saying here is do not seek for yourselves titles of honor or status. That's pride. That's thinking about me. Instead, he says, focus on God and his holiness. Because when we do that, that will remind us that we are little dirty objects. We're sinful. All right? And this is the thing, those who recognize their immeasurable inferiority when compared to God will know it's pointless trying to show others we're worth it. Because we know deep down we're not. All right? Remembering we're little dirty objects protects against pride. But even better than that, says Lewis, is to forget about ourselves altogether. All right? So step two is remember we're small, dirty objects. That's Lewis's quote. Step three, we see in the last two verses. Have a look at verse 11 and 12. The greatest among you will be your servants. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The path to true humility is not by focusing on what others think of us. It's simply by focusing on others. And so here's our final bit of application for today, all right? Step one, know you're proud. Step two, know you're small, dirty objects. And step three, instead of focusing our energy on proving ourselves to others, focus our energy on serving others. Now, not only does this make us feel a million times better than just sitting there in introspection, all right? Sitting there thinking about yourself, it just drags you down. Sitting there thinking about others lifts us up. But on top of that, when we serve others, people actually start to see us as great, as worthy. And we know this because of Jesus. Though he was the greatest person in existence as God, he made himself nothing to serve. And he's now been given the name that is above every other name. But as always, Jesus is not just our role model. He is our servant. All right? And when we see the God of the universe serving us through his death, it makes us realize we little dirty objects are actually loved and accepted by the only person in the universe that matters. All right? The cross is how God fills that God-shaped hole in our heart, meaning we now have less reason to be seen by others. And that's how we defeat pride, brothers and sisters. It's not by trying to defeat it. That just leads to more pride, more me. Right? We defeat pride through less me. And we get less me through more God, okay? Compare ourselves to he who is immeasurably superior to us in every way. And we get less me by serving others rather than serving our egos. So, do not do what the Pharisees do. Do not do things for people to see. Instead, pursue true greatness. For the greatest among you will be your servant.